The morning sun spilled through the tall, narrow windows of the courthouse, casting elongated shadows across the polished marble floor. Outside, the city hummed with the usual bustle, taxis honking, pedestrians hurrying past the federal building. But inside, the atmosphere was heavy, taut with tension, like the string of a bow pulled to its limit. Inside the large courtroom, wooden panels gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, lending an air of gravitas to the proceedings. Rows of benches stretched back, crowded with spectators, family members, and press, their faces etched with anticipation, curiosity, and a subtle undercurrent of anxiety. At the front, the judge's bench loomed over the room, a solid carved monument of authority. The gavel rested at its center, polished and unyielding, symbolizing the power of law and the finality of justice. Behind the bench, the judge's robes hung almost like an aura of solemnity, emphasizing the importance of every word spoken within these walls. The judge himself, a man in his late 50s, with a receding hairline and sharp, perceptive eyes, surveyed the room with a practiced calm. His gaze flicked between the lawyers, witnesses, and spectators, occasionally lingering on the empty space beside the podium, where a small, unassuming figure would soon capture everyone's attention. The defendant, a middle-aged man with weary features, sat at the defense table. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles pale from the grip. He glanced nervously at his attorney, a meticulous woman in a tailored navy suit, who was reviewing her notes with an intensity bordering on obsession. Every so often, the man's gaze drifted toward the judge, then to the gallery, where family members and members of the press waited like an expectant audience. The tension was palpable. It wasn't just a courtroom filled with legal formalities. It was a room thick with unspoken stories, fear, hope, and a sense of something about to break wide open. Among the adults, one figure stood, or rather sat, that seemed incongruous with the seriousness surrounding her. She was a tiny 3-year-old girl, perched on the lap of her mother. In her small hands, she clutched a faded stuffed rabbit, its ears slightly frayed, as if it had been her constant companion for years. Her hair was tied loosely with a pastel ribbon, and her wide, curious eyes scanned the room with a mixture of confusion and fascination. To anyone glancing quickly, she seemed out of place, a delicate spark of innocence amid a sea of somber, stressed adults. Her mother whispered reassurances under her breath, smoothing her daughter's hair, murmuring that everything would be all right. The little girl paid her mother only half attention, distracted by the towering figures, the strange robes, and the sheer size of the courtroom. She was too young to understand the case, too young to grasp the weight of what was happening, but there was a keen awareness in her gaze, a kind of instinctual attentiveness that made her seem older than her 3 years. She shifted slightly, adjusting the stuffed bunny in her lap, her tiny fingers brushing against the soft fabric. The courtroom staff moved efficiently, almost like clockwork, but there was a subtle tension behind their practiced movements. Court clerks shuffled papers, officers adjusted their uniforms, and bailiffs glanced at their watches, the rhythm of the day dictated by procedure, yet haunted by the unpredictability of human behavior. Today, everyone knew something unusual might happen, though no one could predict it would come from the smallest person in the room. At the front of the courtroom, beside the prosecution table, sat a police dog. The dog, a large, muscular German shepherd, radiated alertness and discipline. Its coat was glossy, well-kept, and its ears pricked forward attentively. The handler, a tall officer with a stern expression, rested a hand lightly on the dog's collar. The animal's posture was impeccable, a living instrument of law enforcement, trained to detect danger, substances, or even subtle human cues. To the adults, it was a professional presence, part of the security detail and an essential participant in certain elements of the case. However, the dog was fascinating, a creature of strength and intelligence, far more captivating than the dry legal jargon swirling around her. The gallery was packed with an eclectic mix of people. Some were relatives, faces pale with worry and hope. Some were journalists, pens poised over notepads, cameras perched strategically on shoulders, ready to capture every significant gesture. Others were curious members of the public, drawn by the unusual nature of the case. Murmurs floated through the room like distant echoes, punctuated by the occasional shuffle of a chair or the soft squeak of polished shoes against the floor. Everyone seemed to anticipate something monumental, though no one realized the source would be so small. The trial was set to revolve around an incident that had gripped local news for weeks, a controversial case that had everyone talking. The details were complex, involving allegations that required careful unraveling in court. Lawyers had prepared meticulously, presenting arguments that balanced facts with emotional appeals, each hoping to sway the jury and secure a favorable outcome. Witnesses were lined up, ready to recount events, each aware that the courtroom's scrutiny would amplify their words. But in the midst of these adult concerns, sat quietly, a tiny observer in a world of grown-up dramas. Time seemed to slow as the judge called the court to order. The gavel struck the block, a sound that echoed sharply through the chamber, silencing every whisper and shuffle. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room some stiffly, others reluctantly. The judge entered, his robe flowing behind him, and the gallery settled into a tense, anticipatory quiet. The judge's eyes swept across the courtroom, and for a brief moment they rested on. A small smile flickered across his features, though he said nothing. The juxtaposition was striking. A tiny child amidst the austere symbols of law, yet somehow commanding attention without trying. His gaze wandered naturally, as children do, curious about everything yet understanding little. She watched the lawyers, nodding the way they moved, the rhythm of their gestures, the intensity in their eyes. She watched the officers, the scribes, the press, the family members. Her attention, however, was irresistibly drawn back to the police dog. The dog's calm but alert demeanor fascinated her. Every so often, the dog would flick its ears, tilt its head slightly, or shift its weight, and would mimic the movements subtly with her tiny hands, unaware that her observations were more precise than any adult in the room. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she whispered to herself, as toddlers often do, commenting on the things that adults barely notice. The adults around her were focused on legal strategies, evidence, and argumentation, but her attention was singular and direct. She did not understand the stakes, the implications, or the gravity of the case. Instead, she reacted with pure instinct, with an honesty that comes naturally to children. There was something quietly profound in the way she observed, in the way her small mind catalogued every subtle movement and detail around her. The initial proceedings began, formal, procedural, and meticulously detailed. Lawyers rose, witnesses took the stand, and the judge presided over the exchange with a mixture of patience and authority. Shifted slightly, trying to peek around her mother's shoulder, curious about the proceedings. She did not understand the arguments being made, nor the legal jargon, but she sensed the tension. She sensed the anticipation, the quiet energy in the room that suggested something significant was about to unfold. And unknowingly, she was poised to play a role that would be remembered by everyone present. As the prosecution prepared its first witness, murmurs of excitement rippled through the gallery. Cameras clicked, pens scratched, and the audience leaned in collectively, awaiting the next piece of information that could tilt the trial in one direction or another. The tension was electric, charged with expectation. Yet in the center of it all remained a quiet observer, her fingers clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly, eyes flicking occasionally to the dog, fascinated and unafraid. She was a small island of calm in a sea of adult anxiety, unaware that her moment was approaching, a moment that would stop the courtroom in its tracks. Even the officers, standing at their posts, remained vigilant, eyes sweeping across the room. One officer caught a glimpse of, nodding her calmness, the lack of fussiness, and the unusual focus with which she observed the proceedings. There was an unspoken recognition that something about her presence was quietly magnetic. She seemed to absorb the tension around her without being affected by it, her small size and age making her innocence striking against the backdrop of serious adult matters. As the minutes ticked by, the trial's rhythm began to settle into a predictable pattern, but there was a tension that no procedure could dissolve. Every participant felt it, the sense that the ordinary could shift in an instant, that the flow of events could be altered by something unexpected. And in the center of the room, small hand rested gently on her bunny, her eyes fixed, her attention unwavering. Though she did not yet understand, the forces of curiosity, intuition, and innocence were aligning in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. In that quiet, tense room, the stage was set. Lawyers argued, officers watched, the judge presided, and the press recorded. But the real story, the one that would make the headlines and leave everyone speechless, was quietly preparing itself in the mind of a 3-year-old girl. A girl whose gaze, though small, was sharp, whose curiosity, though innocent, was incisive, whose tiny hands, gripping a well-loved stuffed bunny, would soon point toward an extraordinary revelation. The courtroom, steeped in seriousness, was about to encounter a moment of unanticipated clarity, brought forth not by experience, education, or authority, but by innocence, instinct, and the simple, unfiltered observation of a child. Was a small, quiet presence in a room dominated by adult authority and tension, yet she radiated a kind of unintentional influence. At 3 years old, she was a paradox, both fragile and observant, a miniature witness to a world she did not fully comprehend. Her mother, seated beside her on the gallery bench, kept a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, occasionally brushing stray wisps of hair from her face. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered softly, though her own voice quivered with nerves. Looked up, her wide eyes blinking in curiosity, and offered a tiny, unassuming smile, clutching the frayed ears of her stuffed rabbit. Though she was young, had a remarkable sense of attention. Her gaze was constantly scanning the courtroom, noting details adults overlooked, the slight shuffle of a witness's shoe, the way a lawyer's pen hovered midair before striking paper, the barely perceptible twitch in the police dog's ear. Most people assumed a child of her age would fidget, cry, or be entirely disinterested in such a serious place, but was different. She observed quietly, her mind soaking in every nuance, every sound, every movement. Even the ticking of the wall clock registered in her memory, though she would not yet understand why. Her connection to the case was indirect yet profound. Older brother Liam was a key figure in the events being litigated. He had witnessed a crucial moment, one that the courtroom would discuss in painstaking detail. Did not fully grasp the meaning of witness or testimony, but she sensed the gravity surrounding her family. The tension in the air was palpable, and even without understanding the details, felt the weight of expectation. Her small heart beat a little faster with each passing moment, not from fear, but from an innate sense that something significant was happening. Mother Sarah watched her daughter closely, torn between protecting her innocence and letting her experience the unfolding events. She knew's presence was unusual. Most toddlers would not survive an hour in a room of stiff benches, cold marble floors, and the low murmur of adults in legal battle. Yet there was something in its demeanor that made her mother confident, was calm, observant, and perceptive. Even at 3, she had an uncanny awareness of her surroundings, sensing emotional shifts and subtle changes in tone. This was not a child to be underestimated, though she looked so small and delicate. The courtroom's rhythm was both alien and fascinating too. Voices rose and fell like waves, punctuated by the firm gavel, which startled her slightly each time it landed. She tilted her head curiously, following the echo across the walls. Every sound carried meaning she did not yet comprehend, yet her attention never wavered. When lawyers stood to present evidence, his eyes followed their movements intently, almost as if she were reading a story written in gestures rather than words. She mimicked the gestures subtly with her tiny hands, folding her fingers, tapping her lips thoughtfully, reflecting the curiosity that came naturally to her age. The police dog at the front of the courtroom was primary fascination. She had never seen such a creature up close. Its size, its composure, and the faint aura of authority it seemed to carry intrigued her. Unlike the adults who saw the dog as a tool of law enforcement, saw a being full of silent understanding. Its eyes moved slightly, tracking the witnesses and lawyers, and its ears twitched with subtle reactions. Notice these details immediately, tilting her head in quiet contemplation, whispering to herself in the soft, unstructured language of toddlers. She said things like hello and sit still, phrases adults might have found amusing or insignificant, but which reflected her sharp attention. Her father, David, sat a few rows back, trying to appear composed, though he frequently glanced toward. He was proud of his daughter's composure, yet a part of him worried about her understanding, or misunderstanding, what was happening. He knew the courtroom could be a daunting environment, and he feared that even minor disturbances might unsettle her. But each glance revealed quiet absorption in the scene, her small hand gently clutching her bunny, eyes fixed on both the dog and the speakers at the front. She seemed to navigate the adult world around her with surprising awareness. As the witness testimony began, shifted slightly, leaning against her mother while observing everything in meticulous detail. Her small voice, barely a whisper, mimicked words she had heard adults repeat, such as law, court, and testimony, though without understanding their meaning. She repeated gestures she had seen, the way a lawyer adjusted a tie, the subtle nod of a juror, the sharp glance exchanged between opposing counsel. Observing these actions, she began forming her own narrative, piecing together the story through the lens of movement, tone, and emotion, rather than the precise content of legal arguments. The prosecutor called the first witness, a young man whose hands trembled slightly as he approached the stand. Watched him carefully, nodding the way he shifted weight from one foot to another, the small flicker of anxiety in his eyes. Adults around her analyzed the testimony for credibility, inconsistencies, or emotional impact. However, absorbed the subtle human signals. She was unconsciously reading emotions, the subtle tension of stress, and the hidden cues that often escape adult notice. Though she could not articulate it, she sensed the truth hiding between words, a truth that would soon intersect with her innocent observations. Mother tried to explain softly, "Just watch, honey, listen to the words," nodded obediently, though she did not fully understand the concept of listening for meaning. She understood attention, observation, and curiosity. Every movement, every sound, every glance mattered. She noticed when the officer's hand shifted slightly, when the dog's ears flicked toward the witness, and when the judge's gaze sharpened in thought. These details, invisible to most adults under the pressure of formal proceedings, were recorded in his mind with vivid clarity. The courtroom itself seemed almost alive, responding to each new word and gesture. Murmurs flowed through the gallery, punctuated by sudden gasps or stifled coughs. The officers maintained their disciplined posture, yet subtle shifts indicated attentiveness to the unfolding drama. Lawyers moved methodically, their expressions carefully controlled, each aware that a single gesture or phrase could shift the momentum. Absorbed it all, her perception heightened by the absence of preconceptions. Her understanding was not intellectual, but intuitive, a raw, unfiltered sense of the unfolding events. As the morning progressed, his attention remained unwavering. While most children would have fidgeted or become bored, she was captivated. The combination of human drama, the presence of the police dog, and the intricate dance of gestures and expressions held her focus entirely. She leaned forward occasionally, her small fingers pressing into her stuffed rabbit as though seeking grounding. She watched not for the content of the trial, but for the unspoken truths revealed through actions, postures, and the subtle interplay of human behavior. At one point, a lawyer's voice rose sharply in argument, flinched slightly but quickly adjusted, watching the reactions of those around her. She noticed the jury shift in their seats, the defendant's hand tightening around a pen, and the slight lift of the dog's ears. Adults might have dismissed these as minor details, but attention to them would prove crucial. She was noticing patterns, forming connections, and preparing, without knowing it, to make an observation that would resonate far beyond her small size and age. The judge's gavel struck again, bringing temporary silence to the courtroom. Looked up, intrigued by the sudden sharp sound. She observed how every adult's body language changed, Some stiffened, some relaxed, some whispered to neighbors, and she registered these subtle cues with remarkable clarity. Her 3-year-old mind processed the energy shifts, the tension and relief, the focus and distraction. Though she could not articulate it, was learning something fundamental. That observation, attention, and intuition could reveal truths adults often missed. Curiosity eventually returned to the police dog. She leaned slightly forward, head tilted, eyes tracking its every subtle motion. She noticed how the dog shifted weight from one paw to another, how its nose twitched slightly, and how it occasionally glanced toward the defense table. Adults may have seen only a trained animal sitting quietly, but observed intent, focus, and awareness. Something in her young mind recognized the dog's engagement with the environment, though she could not yet understand its significance. Her fascination was pure, unclouded by preconceptions, and quietly potent. As the morning wore on, the courtroom's proceedings continued with formal decorum, yet remained the quiet, perceptive presence in the room. She whispered small observations to herself, unnoticed by most, commenting on gestures, movements, and the occasional tone of voice. Every sound, glance, and motion was noted. Her mother occasionally hushed her softly, but its attention was unwavering, her curiosity insatiable. It was as though she were silently cataloging everything around her, preparing for a moment that no adult anticipated, a moment that would shift the courtroom's focus entirely. And so sat small, quiet, observant, her innocence and perception quietly building to a point of revelation. She did not understand the weight of the trial, nor the legal stakes, but her mind absorbed details with unmatched clarity. Every movement, sound, and gesture was recorded, unnoticed by others, yet perfectly aligned to set the stage for an extraordinary moment that would leave the courtroom, and everyone in it utterly speechless. The morning wore on, and the courtroom, though bustling with activity, began to settle into a rhythm. Witnesses gave their statements, lawyers interjected with carefully measured questions, and the judge maintained a steady hand, keeping order with quiet authority. Yet beneath the procedural motions, a tension lingered, palpable and electric. Everyone in the room felt it, an anticipation they could not fully explain, a sense that the ordinary flow of the trial could shift in an instant. Little did they know, that shift would come from the most unlikely source. A 3-year-old girl quietly perched in the gallery. Sat motionless, her small fingers tightly gripping the frayed ears of her stuffed rabbit. She had absorbed every detail of the morning, the rise and fall of voices, the shifting stances of attorneys, the subtle cues from jurors and witnesses. But her focus was singular, the police dog. To the adults, the animal was merely present as part of courtroom protocol, a trained officer performing its duty. To the dog was alive, attentive, and almost sentient. Every flick of its ears, every slight movement of its tail, captured her gaze completely. The dog's handler, officer, remained vigilant, his hand lightly resting on the animal's collar. The pair had been brought in to demonstrate a crucial element of the case, though the precise relevance had yet to be revealed to the audience. The dog, obedient and disciplined, sat perfectly still, yet noticed the minute, almost imperceptible ways it reacted to the environment. Its eyes flicked briefly toward a piece of evidence, its ears twitched as a witness shifted nervously, and its body shifted slightly in response to something no adult seemed to register. She tilted her head, studying the dog with a focused curiosity that bordered on intensity. The courtroom's attention was divided, mostly consumed by the testimony of the latest witness, a man recounting events with hesitancy, speaking in careful, cautious sentences. Lawyers leaned forward, pens poised, ears straining for inconsistencies. The judge listened intently, occasionally jotting notes or signaling brief interjections. But amidst this calculated scrutiny, small, silent observation was uniquely untainted. She was not influenced by expectation or strategy, only by pure perception. Something about the witness's testimony caught attention. It wasn't the words exactly. She did not fully understand them, but the subtle change in the witness's demeanor, the faint tremor in his hands, and the slight tilt of his head. The dog reacted too, a small shift in posture, ears flicking sharply. His young mind recognized the correlation immediately. She blinked rapidly, processing the connection with the unfiltered logic only a child could possess. There was a truth in the room that adults had missed, and her curiosity ignited with sudden intensity. His mother noticed her daughter leaning forward slightly, whispering softly to herself. "What is it, sweetie?" Sarah asked, trying to mask the tension in her own voice. Shook her head subtly, her eyes never leaving the dog. "Just watch," she whispered, barely audible. Her mother smiled faintly, uncertain but trusting her daughter's instincts. His father, sitting a few rows behind, felt a mixture of pride and unease. He had long recognized that his daughter was unusually perceptive for her age, but even he could not predict what would happen next. The room, oblivious to silent calculations, continued with the formalities of the trial. Lawyers asked questions, witnesses answered, and the jury recorded their observations. The police dog remained a steady presence, seemingly passive, yet its posture betrayed subtle attentiveness. Small hand twitched slightly in response, fingers brushing her rabbit, her mind racing to connect the dots she alone perceived. Adults dismissed the dog as an object of procedure, but saw a living instrument of observation, reacting to truths invisible to human eyes. Time seemed to slow. The murmur of the courtroom became background noise, a gentle hum beneath focused attention. Her eyes darted between the witness, the dog, and the lawyers, absorbing every subtle cue. The world around her, chaotic to the untrained adult eye, unfolded in patterns she intuitively recognized. The dog's posture had shifted again, ears pricked, muscles tensed slightly, nose twitching. Something was being revealed, a subtle warning or insight the adults had not noticed. Instincts screamed that this moment was significant. A hush began to fall over the courtroom as the witness concluded a hesitant sentence. The lawyers leaned forward, expecting responses, rebuttals, or objections. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing an unspoken tension, though he could not yet identify its source. Everyone awaited the next formal motion, unaware that the disruption would not come from lawyers, witnesses, or the gavel, but from a tiny, 3-year-old girl whose attention had fixed on the police dog. Small hand lifted, almost imperceptibly at first. Her tiny finger extended toward the dog, shaking slightly with a combination of excitement and apprehension. Adults nearby did not notice, distracted by the usual chaos of procedural activity. The dog, seemingly aware of the movement, flicked its ears once sharply. Its mother leaned closer, whispering gently, "Honey," but ignored her, entirely absorbed in the moment. Her gaze was unwavering, her mind fixed on the connection she alone had discerned between the witness's behavior and the dog's subtle signals. The courtroom's tension grew as lawyers prepared for another round of questions. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling readiness to proceed. The officer with the police dog shifted slightly, sensing some unseen energy in the room. The dog's body language became more alert, more focused, responding to cues invisible to anyone but. She adjusted her position on her mother's lap, pressing forward just enough to align her finger with the dog, and whispered softly to herself, "There it is." The words were inaudible to the rest of the room, but they marked the culmination of her quiet observation, the point where attention would turn to revelation. For a moment's action seemed insignificant, a small movement in a room of monumental human concerns. Yet the subtle shift of her finger, the tiny tilt of her head, and the unspoken tension in her posture began to ripple outward. The dog's ears flicked sharply in response, catching the attention of the handler, who glanced quickly at the judge. For the first time, someone outside recognized that something unusual was occurring. The courtroom paused, though no one yet understood what would happen. His finger trembled slightly as she pointed directly at the police dog. Her eyes, wide and focused, locked onto the animal's gaze, and for the first time, the room's collective attention began to notice her presence. The judge's eyes flicked downward toward the gallery, observing the tiny figure whose seriousness was disproportionate to her age. Lawyers glanced up from their notes, surprised by the unexpected movement. Reporters shifted slightly in their seats, pens hovering over paper, sensing that the moment about to unfold was extraordinary. Then came the sound, soft but clear, a tiny voice, "Bad dog." The words cut through the murmurs of the courtroom like a sharp knife. Gasps echoed immediately. Some spectators leaned forward, startled, unsure if they had heard correctly. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances, murmuring incredulously. The judge froze mid-note, brow furrowed, as he turned toward the gallery. Officers looked toward the girl, astonishment evident in their expressions. Even the witness paused mid-sentence, caught between confusion and the sudden weight of the child's declaration. Repeated the words, louder this time with conviction, pointing firmly at the dog. "Bad dog." Her voice, small yet unmistakable, carried a clarity that demanded attention. Adults who had spent hours analyzing testimony, reviewing evidence, and strategizing their arguments were momentarily silenced. The courtroom, dominated by adult authority, had been interrupted by the unfiltered honesty of a toddler. The absurdity and power of the moment collided, creating an atmosphere of disbelief and awe. The dog, trained for focus and discipline, responded instinctively. Its ears twitched, body shifted slightly, and a subtle growl emitted, soft, controlled, almost imperceptible, highlighting the truth it perceived. The officer handled the situation calmly, yet his eyes reflected surprise. The connection between the child's observation and the dog's reaction was undeniable. This was no ordinary courtroom disturbance. It was a moment of revelation, delivered from a source everyone had underestimated. The murmurs swelled into audible whispers, spreading rapidly across the courtroom. Lawyers paused mid-argument, witnesses froze, and even the jury leaned forward, intrigued and uncertain. Remained focused, unaware of the attention she had drawn. Her small fingers remained extended toward the dog, her gaze unwavering, her voice steady and precise. She had noticed something adults had missed, and in the simple, innocent way of a child, she had spoken truth that no experience, no authority could suppress. The judge finally cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Order in the court," he said, his voice firm but tinged with surprise. Yet even he could not ignore the significance of what had just occurred. He glanced toward, nodding her composure, the clarity in her eyes, and the quiet authority of her small voice. This was not a mere disruption. It was an extraordinary observation that demanded attention and consideration. In that moment, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted irreversibly. What had been procedural, predictable, and formal transformed into a scene of wonder and astonishment. Everyone, lawyers, officers, jurors, witnesses, spectators, recognized that something remarkable had occurred. A child, unaware of the weight of her words, had captured the essence of truth hidden in plain sight, and the entire room felt it. His innocent gesture, pointing at the dog and speaking two simple words, had stopped time in the courtroom. Adults who believed themselves in control of the narrative were rendered silent. Witnesses who felt confident in their testimony paused, and the jury leaned forward in collective anticipation. The smallest voice in the room had spoken with authority, clarity, and truth, leaving everyone stunned and profoundly aware of the unpredictability of human insight. The moment was fragile, electric, and unforgettable. Oblivious to the magnitude of her action, simply maintained her gaze on the dog, waiting, watching, sensing that the reaction she had anticipated was about to unfold. The courtroom, now silent but for the soft whisper of the judge's gavel, awaited the unfolding consequences of a child's observation, a revelation no adult could have anticipated. The courtroom fell into a sudden, surreal silence. Small voice, clear and unmistakable, echoed faintly yet profoundly, "Bad dog." The words were brief, composed of only 2 syllables, yet their impact was monumental. They cut through the cacophony of legal jargon, whispered discussions, and the subtle rustling of papers like a lightning bolt. All eyes turned toward the tiny figure, perched on her mother's lap, her small finger still pointed at the police dog. For a moment, no one moved, spoke, or even blinked. The simplicity of her statement, so innocent, so childlike, was juxtaposed against the weight and tension of the courtroom, leaving everyone in a state of suspended disbelief. At first, the reaction was confusion. Jurors exchanged puzzled glances, their eyebrows raised in synchronized question. Lawyers froze mid-sentence, pens hovering above their notebooks as they attempted to process what they had just heard. The defendant's jaw slackened slightly, his eyes flicking between and the dog, unsure of whether to dismiss the child's observation as a harmless distraction or to recognize its unsettling accuracy. Even the judge, a man seasoned by decades in the courtroom, leaned forward in his chair, frowning slightly, astonished that such clarity and observation had come from someone so young. Officers reacted almost instinctively. The dog's handler, officer, stiffened hand on the dog's collar. His eyes widened in recognition. The dog, trained to respond to cues, reacted subtly. A shift in its weight, a tiny flick of its tail, and a careful glance at the witness. It was as if simple words had unlocked a truth previously unnoticed, exposing a nuance in the animal's behavior that had been invisible to every adult present. Looked at the judge, silently acknowledging the moment's gravity. He knew the courtroom had just experienced something extraordinary, something that explanation yet demanded attention. His mother gasped softly, instinctively covering her mouth with her hand. She whispered, a mixture of awe, concern, and disbelief in her tone. Her gaze met her daughter, and she saw no fear, no hesitation, only the clarity and conviction that had produced those two unforgettable words. His father, sitting a few rows back, had frozen entirely. His hands gripped the edge of the bench as he stared, heart pounding. He had known was perceptive beyond her years, but nothing could have prepared him for the authority carried by a 3-year-old's innocent declaration. The murmurs began almost immediately, spreading like a wave through the courtroom. Spectators whispered, their voices tinged with astonishment and curiosity. "Did she just?" one woman muttered. "She called it bad," another asked, eyes wide. Reporters scribbled furiously, some pulling out cameras, eager to capture the unprecedented moment. Every member of the audience realized that this was no ordinary disruption. Something fundamental had shifted. A child's words had pierced the formal, controlled environment of the courtroom, commanding attention in a way adults had not anticipated. The judge, after a moment's pause, cleared his throat, attempting to regain composure. "Order," he said firmly, though his tone betrayed a flicker of surprise. He looked down studying her face intently. Her wide eyes, unblinking and unwavering, met his gaze. There was no mischief, no exaggeration, only a rare clarity that transcended age. The judge's experienced mind tried to process the moment rationally, but the simplicity and precision of her statement made it impossible to dismiss. He made a mental note to allow the courtroom to consider this unexpected observation. Lawyers reacted differently according to temperament. The prosecution leaned back, momentarily caught off guard, but a subtle smile appeared. They recognized the potential impact of his declaration on the case. They had observed the dog's role, the witness's subtle cues, and the potential revelation hidden in plain sight. The defense, by contrast, stiffened, a flicker of concern crossing their face. A child's words had punctured the controlled narrative they had meticulously built. There was a silent acknowledgement that statement might influence perceptions of credibility, evidence, and attention to detail. The defendant's expression shifted between confusion and disbelief. He had expected courtroom drama, arguments, and witness testimony to sway the proceedings, but never a child's observation. Small voice had leveled the field in a way adults could not anticipate. He shifted uneasily in his chair, realizing that the courtroom's focus had temporarily shifted from him and his lawyers to a tiny figure with remarkable perceptiveness. The irony was profound. The most powerful influence in the room came not from experience, education, or authority, but from innocence and intuition. Officer moved slightly, his hand resting lightly on the dog's collar, as if steadying both the animal and himself. The dog, trained to react to subtle environmental cues, had responded in the moment's preceding words. The slight movements, the attentive ears, the tiny adjustments, all of which had noticed, now seemed prophetic. Adults realized that her statement was not mere babble. It was an observation of behavior, an insight into the subtle communication between human and animal that had gone unnoticed by trained professionals. Repeated her words once more, firmer this time. "Bad dog." The courtroom's energy shifted again. Witnesses looked toward her, unsure of whether to smile, be concerned, or ignore the comment. Some scribbled notes, unable to ignore the child who had so succinctly captured attention. Jurors leaned forward, curiosity sparked. Even seasoned journalists recognized the moment's uniqueness, raising their cameras and microphones discreetly to document what could become a historic anecdote in courtroom observation. Every individual sensed that this was a moment that transcended ordinary legal procedure. The gallery's reaction grew louder, a mixture of amusement, astonishment, and awe. A few whispered to neighbors, commenting on the irony and profundity of a toddler's clarity. One elderly man shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Only a child could see it." A woman near the back covered her mouth to stifle laughter, while others leaned forward, enchanted by the extraordinary scene unfolding. Remained focused, unaware of the ripple effect she had caused, her gaze locked on the dog as though ensuring the world understood her observation. The dog, still calm but alert, shifted slightly, signaling a subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement of attention. Officer adjusted his posture, watching the child with a mixture of curiosity and respect. He had trained dogs for years, observed their responses in countless scenarios, but this interaction was unprecedented. The simplicity and precision of perception had revealed something adults had overlooked. The animal's subtle acknowledgement seemed almost synchronous with her statement, creating a perfect, unspoken alignment between human and canine observation. The judge, recognizing the moment's gravity, allowed a brief pause in proceedings. "Let us take a moment," he said, voice steady but reflective. "It appears we have witnessed something unusual." Attorneys exchanged looks, weighing the impact of the child's declaration on the case and strategy. Witnesses adjusted their posture, some smiling quietly, others appearing slightly embarrassed at having overlooked what had seen. Jurors whispered softly, debating the meaning of the words, while spectators leaned in, captivated by the spectacle of a toddler commanding attention in a courtroom. His mother tried to remain composed, though her chest tightened with both pride and anxiety. She leaned closer to her daughter, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, whispering, "Sweetie, you're amazing," looked up at her mother, her small eyes reflecting nothing but calm clarity. She did not seek approval, nor did she understand the full consequences of her statement. Yet she sensed its importance, the shift in energy and the focus it had created. Her words had carved a path through the grown-ups' preoccupation, and the impact was undeniable. The courtroom atmosphere shifted from tension to wonder. Adults who had been consumed by procedure and strategy now found themselves reconsidering the simplest elements of observation and truth. Lawyers, officers, and the judge all recognized that statement, brief and innocent, had exposed a subtle but critical insight. Her ability to notice and articulate the dog's behavior disrupted expectations and reshaped the room's dynamic. No one could have predicted that a 3-year-old would become the fulcrum upon which attention pivoted. Even the defendant seemed momentarily humanized by the moment. He looked at, a mixture of bemusement and admiration in his eyes. The raw honesty of a child, unencumbered by experience, authority, or personal stake, had pierced the formal structures he had relied upon. For a fleeting moment, he understood the unfiltered clarity of innocence and how it could affect perception, judgment, and emotion. His 2 words had reminded everyone present of something long forgotten. Truth often emerges where least expected. The judge's gavel tapped lightly on the bench, attempting to restore formal order, but the energy in the room had irreversibly changed. Every person in the courtroom now viewed the case through a new lens, one colored by wonder, humility, and the quiet astonishment of seeing profound insight from an unlikely source. Witnesses straightened, jurors leaned forward, and attorneys recalculated strategies, acknowledging the subtle but undeniable impact of observation. Still perched on her mother's lap, quietly observed the reactions. Her tiny hands had released the bunny momentarily, now gently resting on the edge of her mother's sleeve. She had not intended to command attention, nor to shift the course of the trial. Yet in the simplicity of her perception, she had done exactly that. The words "bad dog," brief and unassuming, had rippled through the courtroom like a pebble thrown into a still pond, touching every observer and altering the environment in ways adults struggled to comprehend. The murmurs swelled again, some soft, some barely audible, others tinged with laughter and disbelief. The courtroom had become a stage where innocence met authority, where observation from the smallest voice revealed truths adults had missed. Its quiet, deliberate focus had demonstrated something profound, that sometimes the most powerful insights emerge not from experience or education, but from clarity of attention, unburdened by expectation. In that moment, the room was united in astonishment. The judge, lawyers, witnesses, jurors, officers, and spectators all shared the same silent acknowledgement. A 3-year-old girl had spoken truth with unmatched clarity, her words shaping perception, commanding attention, and leaving a lasting impression. Remained calm, focused, and entirely unaware of the extraordinary mark she had made on everyone present. Her simple declaration had not only interrupted the proceedings, it had reshaped them. The courtroom had paused to acknowledge her observation, and in doing so had learned an unexpected lesson, that attention, clarity, and honesty are not bound by age, size, or authority. 2 words spoken with innocence and precision had become a defining moment in a courtroom filled with adults trained to scrutinize every detail. The courtroom had been thrown into a strange, almost surreal state. 2 words "bad dog" had reverberated far beyond their simplicity. Lawyers paused mid-motion, fingers frozen above pens, mouths slightly open. Jurors leaned forward in unison, trying to reconcile the sheer innocence of a 3-year-old with the gravity of the courtroom. The defendant slumped back in his chair, a mix of incredulity and unease crossing his features. The room, structured for order, had been momentarily disrupted by a force no one could have predicted. A toddler armed only with observation, curiosity, and honesty. Whispers flowed across the gallery like ripples. "Did she just say that?" A woman muttered to her neighbor, eyes wide. "Is she serious?" Another shook her head, chuckling quietly, unable to contain the mixture of amusement and astonishment. The murmurs built slowly, crescendoing into a low hum of excitement and disbelief. Reporters leaned forward, frantically scribbling notes and raising their cameras. Every person in the room, from spectators to attorneys, understood the magnitude of what had just happened. This was not mere disruption, it was a revelation in miniature form. Officer glanced down at the dog, noting subtle behavioral shifts. The German Shepherd had responded before spoke, alert yet controlled, attuned to signals invisible to human eyes. Now, after her declaration, the dog's posture seemed to affirm her observation. Its ears flicked slightly, eyes sharp, tail still, muscles taut. To a trained professional, it was both fascinating and uncanny. The dog, in its disciplined awareness, had been observed by a child, and the alignment of perception was startling. Had not only noticed, but had interpreted a subtle truth overlooked by everyone else. The judge, a seasoned figure accustomed to unexpected interruptions, leaned forward in his chair, fingers tapping lightly on the polished wood. His sharp eyes scanned the courtroom, taking in the reactions, some shocked, some amused, others thoughtful. He cleared his throat, attempting to restore decorum while silently marveling at the scene. "Order," he said, voice firm but tinged with surprise. "It appears we have a unique situation." His gaze lingered on, nodding her calm, unwavering composure. Unlike the adults, she seemed entirely unaffected by the sudden attention, as if she were fully aware of the truth she had just revealed. Lawyers reacted differently, as temperament dictated. The prosecution leaned back in their chair, a faint, knowing smile crossing their face. They recognized the potential significance of words, understanding that they had illuminated a subtle truth that could influence perception. The defense stiffened, eyebrows furrowed, glancing between the dog and their client. A 3-year-old had spoken with clarity and authority, challenging years of preparation and strategy in a single, unanticipated moment. The irony was unmistakable. The most incisive observation in the courtroom had come from its youngest, least experienced participant. Spectators continued to whisper, the sound swelling into a low, excited murmur. Phones were raised discreetly, cameras aimed subtly, and reporters scribbled furiously. Some faces showed delight at the unexpected comedy of the moment, while others reflected awe at the sheer clarity and courage displayed by a child so young. It was simultaneously a humorous and profound scene, one that had no precedent in the observer's experience. A toddler had, with innocence and focus, momentarily seized control of a courtroom, drawing attention to details overlooked by the most trained and experienced adults present. His mother instinctively reached down, resting a hand on her daughter's tiny shoulder. She whispered softly, "Honey, you've made everyone stop and listen." Blinked, tilting her head slightly, unsure what the reaction meant. Her small hand, still gripping the rabbit, twitched slightly with curiosity. She had not intended to command attention or alter proceedings. Her observation had been simple, honest, and instinctive. Yet the adults' reactions highlighted an undeniable truth. The innocence of a child could cut through the weighty structures of procedure and authority in a way that experience often could not. Even the defendant appeared affected. He leaned slightly forward, frowning, trying to gauge whether the child's words were meaningful or merely coincidental. He had spent months worrying about legal strategy, witness credibility, and courtroom procedure, but now all attention had shifted to his declaration. The paradox was humbling. The room's most powerful truth had come not from reasoned argumentation or practiced rhetoric, but from perception and observation unfiltered by experience. His brow furrowed, a mix of irritation and astonishment playing across his face. The jury, previously attentive but neutral, shifted their posture in collective focus. Whispers passed discreetly among them, but every head was turned toward. Some jurors leaned slightly forward, intrigued, questioning the meaning behind the child's words. Others exchanged silent glances, acknowledging the impossibility of ignoring the statement's timing, precision, and simplicity. The child's insight had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond her size or years, subtly influencing the courtroom's collective perception. The officers present were equally affected. Even those trained to anticipate unusual behavior from the public paused, recognizing that observation had merit. Officer, maintaining professional composure, made a subtle note to review the dog's behavior later. He realized that the child's words were not arbitrary. They were accurate, perceptive, and delivered with clarity that had commanded the room's attention. His eyes met briefly, as if to silently acknowledge her insight and the uncanny alignment between her perception and the dog's trained instincts. Unaware of the attention, simply maintained her posture, her finger still pointed subtly at the dog. She had not expected applause, reaction, or acknowledgement. She was focused entirely on what she saw, a subtle interaction between the witness and the dog that adults had missed. Her small voice, however, had accomplished more than she could have known. It had stopped the procedural momentum of the trial and demanded attention from every adult present. This pause, though brief, would have lasting significance, reshaping perceptions and drawing focus to details previously overlooked. The courtroom atmosphere shifted. What had been a formal, procedural setting became something akin to a tableau of wonder, curiosity, and unexpected revelation. Adults recognized that this moment transcended the usual flow of evidence and testimony. They watched in awe, understanding that a child's honesty and observation had illuminated a truth previously hidden. Witnesses straightened in their seats, lawyers recalibrated silently, and even the judge considered the implications carefully. Small words had fundamentally altered the room's energy. Laughter, quiet and incredulous, began to ripple through some corners of the gallery. Spectators, realizing the absurdity and brilliance of the moment, smiled and chuckled. His words were simple, almost comical in their brevity, yet their significance was undeniable. The courtroom, a place normally defined by authority and meticulous procedure, had been disrupted in a way that was both amusing and profound. Adults recognized the rarity of the event. Clarity and truth delivered without artifice, strategy, or preparation, only through perception and instinct. The judge adjusted his notes, tapping the gavel lightly once more. "Let us proceed," he said, his tone now a mix of authority and reluctant admiration. "We will acknowledge the observation made and consider it as we continue with the proceedings." Attorneys nodded subtly, understanding that the courtroom's dynamics had shifted. Witnesses straightened, some smirking, others blinking in astonishment. The room had been subtly humbled, reminded that sometimes the most profound insights come from the most unexpected sources. His mother squeezed her daughter's shoulder gently, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary impact. She whispered softly, "You've made everyone notice, sweetie," tilted her head, her gaze returning to the dog. She was unaware of the weight of her words or the ripple effect they had created. She had only acted on observation, guided by curiosity, instinct, and the clarity that comes naturally to a child. Yet the room had listened, paused, and been profoundly affected by her insight. Even the press took notice. Cameras zoomed in discreetly, capturing the scene, while journalists scribbled furiously, trying to describe a moment that ordinary explanation. Some whispered about how unusual it was for a toddler's words to carry such weight. Others recognized that the subtlety and honesty of statement could make it a defining anecdote in the story of the trial. The courtroom had become a stage for an unexpected narrative, one where a child's perception trumped the experience and expectations of the most seasoned adults. Simple declaration had accomplished something remarkable. It had disrupted the flow of the trial, shifted attention, and reminded everyone present of the power of observation untainted by bias, experience, or expectation. Lawyers recalculated their strategies, officers adjusted their attention, witnesses became more aware of subtle behaviors, and jurors leaned forward with renewed curiosity. The courtroom, once dominated by procedural formality, now operated under a new awareness, that truth and insight could come from the sources. The ripple effect continued. Spectators whispered, exchanged glances, and smiled quietly at the brilliance of the moment. Some found humor in the irony, others marveled at the clarity of perception. Simple, direct words had pierced layers of experience, procedure, and expectation. Adults, trained for years to interpret evidence and gauge credibility, were forced to acknowledge that a child's innocent clarity had illuminated what they had missed. It was a reminder, subtle but profound, that the unexpected often carries more truth than preparation ever could. As the trial resumed, a newfound tension and respect hung in the air. Adults remained aware of the child's presence, sometimes glancing her way, recognizing that her observation had already altered the courtroom's dynamics. Returned to her stuffed rabbit, tilting her head slightly as though she had not changed anything, yet the room had shifted irreversibly. The simplicity and clarity of her insight had created a moment that would be remembered long after the trial concluded, a reminder of the power of innocence, focus, and unfiltered observation. The courtroom remained charged with the echo of two words, "bad dog." Though brief, their impact was profound, like a spark igniting a room long accustomed to procedural monotony. The judge, aware of the unusual nature of the situation, leaned back slightly in his chair, steepling his fingers and considering the implications. He had seen disruptions before, arguments, outbursts, and even rare moments of courtroom comedy, but nothing like this. A toddler's simple observation had punctured the rigid structure of the room, drawing attention to a detail adults had overlooked, and everyone felt the weight of it. Lawyers began to whisper among themselves, recalibrating strategies in real time. The prosecution, seizing upon the potential evidentiary significance of the statement, exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the subtle weights words carried. "It's incredible," one whispered, adjusting notes, "but she's right. The dog's behavior was inconsistent with the witness's story." The defense, conversely, leaned in with furrowed brows, recognizing the challenge. How to respond to a truth articulated so simply and yet so perceptively, without dismissing it as childish babble. The jury, captivated, shifted in their seats, leaning forward with a renewed sense of curiosity. Jurors had been trained to evaluate testimony critically, to analyze consistency and credibility, yet this was different. The simplicity of words carried a force adults could not ignore. They whispered softly among themselves, debating tone, context, and implication. "Do you think she really means it?" one juror asked, incredulous. Another shook their head, smiling. "I don't know, but you can't deny the dog reacted too." The murmurs reflected awe and bemusement, a courtroom grappling with the unexpected power of innocence. Spectators were equally captivated. Were discreetly raised, cameras adjusted, and journalists scribbled furiously, trying to capture a narrative that was both compelling and unprecedented. Some laughed quietly, charmed by the simplicity of a toddler's words, while others shook their heads in disbelief, recognizing the profound implications of what had just occurred. Unaware of the chaos she had sparked, simply returned to her stuffed rabbit, her finger still occasionally twitching toward the police dog in subtle, instinctive focus. Officer, still standing at the front, maintained composure but could not hide his astonishment. The dog had behaved exactly as had perceived, alert, subtly responsive, and attuned to cues invisible to all other adults. Had trained the animal for years, yet even he found the child's observation uncanny. He bent slightly, whispering to a colleague, "She noticed what we couldn't see. That's remarkable." The dog, sensing the shift in attention, flicked its ears, a subtle acknowledgement of the tiny observer's insight. It was as if innocence had unlocked a layer of perception adults were too conditioned to recognize. The judge finally spoke, his tone measured but reflective. "This court has encountered unusual circumstances before, but rarely have we witnessed such clarity from so young a mind," he said. His voice carried authority yet tempered awe. He glanced at, nodding her calm composure. "We will consider her observation as part of the proceedings," he continued, carefully choosing his words to balance formality with acknowledgement. "It is a reminder that insight is not limited by age, experience, or expectation." His statement rippled through the courtroom, prompting quiet nods and soft murmurs of agreement. The prosecution adjusted their approach subtly. They began framing questions to highlight the alignment between the dog's behavior and testimony, knowing that observation had made the courtroom more attentive to minute details. Each movement of the dog, each glance or twitch, was now scrutinized more carefully. Witnesses, aware of the new focal point, shifted slightly, becoming more conscious of behavior, tone, and gesture. Words had introduced an unexpected variable into proceedings, and every participant responded with heightened awareness. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to mitigate the potential impact. The attorney rose, voice calm but deliberate, addressing the jury with a carefully chosen blend of levity and strategy. "While it is remarkable that a young child has noticed something we may have overlooked, let us remember that children perceive the world differently than adults," the attorney said. "Her observation, though honest, may not carry the same weight as trained analysis or corroborated testimony." The jury nodded, some thoughtful, some skeptical, acknowledging the attempt to frame the statement without dismissing its intrigue entirely. Spectators reacted with a mixture of amusement and admiration. Some whispered jokes under their breath, "I'd like her on my legal team," while others exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the rare power of clarity untainted by preconception. Observation had injected a note of levity into the tense, procedural courtroom without diminishing the gravity of the trial. Her innocence, coupled with perceptiveness, created a moment both profound and subtly humorous, leaving adults simultaneously humbled and entertained. The defendant's reaction was complex. He frowned, realizing that his carefully constructed narrative had been punctured in a way he had not anticipated. A 3-year-old had drawn attention to a detail adults had missed, subtly undermining perception and focus. He glanced at, momentarily captivated by her small stature, yet commanding influence. Her calm focus and unerring observation forced of his expectations, reminding him that truth often emerges from the most unlikely sources. Mother Sarah quietly adjusted her daughter on her lap, whispering reassurance. She marveled at her child's composure, recognizing the extraordinary clarity he had displayed. However, remained calm, entirely unaware of her influence. She was focused on observation, on noticing the subtle shifts in the dog and the people around her. Her words had triggered a wave of reflection, humor, and across the courtroom. Yet she continued as if nothing remarkable had occurred, perfectly embodying the unself-conscious clarity of childhood. Journalists in the gallery began murmuring among themselves, debating how to report the event. Some discussed the novelty, a toddler affecting courtroom perception. Others considered the human interest angle, highlighting the surprising intersection of innocence and truth. Cameras clicked quietly, and notes were scribbled with urgency. The narrative was compelling. A courtroom, filled with authority, experience, and procedure, had been subtly and irrevocably influenced by the simple observation of a child. Had created a story worth telling, one that combined humor, astonishment, and the profundity of unfiltered perception. The jury, now more attentive than ever, followed subsequent testimony with renewed focus. Subtle behaviors, the twitch of a finger, the shift of a gaze, the dog's minor adjustments, were noted and discussed among themselves. His declaration had heightened sensitivity to nuance, reminding everyone that even the smallest detail could carry significance. The trial, which had previously relied on structured argumentation and evidence, had now incorporated a new lens, one shaped by observation, intuition, and the clarity of a child's mind. Even the officers, trained to anticipate unusual behavior, were impressed. They shared brief, subtle nods, acknowledging that insight had revealed a layer of observation adults could easily overlook. The dog's reactions were now viewed with renewed attention, and its subtle behaviors were integrated into how participants perceived the witness and the case. Simple words had created a ripple effect that extended beyond humor or surprise. They had shaped perception, strategy, and attention in a courtroom environment. Herself remained undisturbed. She adjusted her small fingers around the rabbit, tilting her head slightly to watch the dog. She occasionally murmured soft observations, nearly inaudible. "Watch there," she said, her eyes tracking the animal's movements with precision. Adults strained to hear but realized these were private, instinctive musings. Even without understanding their exact words, it was clear she was processing, analyzing, and observing with a clarity and focus that none had anticipated. The courtroom's energy was transformed. The formal, procedural tone persisted, yet undercurrents of astonishment, subtle humor, and admiration permeated every corner. Lawyers carefully chose words, witnesses became more aware of gestures, jurors remained attentive to nuance, and spectators whispered in wonder. Had shifted attention, recalibrated expectations, and injected a rare mix of levity and profundity into proceedings. Her words were brief, but their consequences were lasting. The judge tapped the gavel lightly again, seeking to guide proceedings while acknowledging the extraordinary moment. "Let us continue with testimony," he said, voice firm but reflective. "However, the court will recognize that sometimes insight can come from unexpected sources, reminding us that truth is not solely the domain of experience." Heads nodded, murmurs of agreement rippled softly, and lawyers, officers, and spectators alike resumed attention, now filtered through the lens had created. In that courtroom, a subtle but profound lesson had been delivered. In her simplicity and innocence, had demonstrated the power of observation untainted by expectation. Adults, trained and experienced, had been momentarily humbled. Humor, astonishment, and admiration mingled as the trial continued, now under the quiet influence of a tiny voice that had spoken truth in the simplest, most direct manner. His presence was no longer incidental. It had become a focal point, a quiet force shaping attention, perception, and understanding. The courtroom, though resuming formal proceedings, remained subtly altered. His declaration "bad dog" had injected a quiet but undeniable tension into the room, and the ripple effect was immediate. Witnesses, previously confident in their composure, now found themselves under an invisible microscope, acutely aware that their smallest gestures could attract attention. Lawyers, already skilled in reading human behavior, now factored in not just the dog, the evidence, or prior testimony, but the unusual perspective of a 3-year-old observer, whose simple words had already commanded the room's focus. The prosecution leaned forward, quietly signaling to their team. They knew observation, brief as it was, had highlighted an inconsistency in the witness's demeanor. Each subtle movement of the dog, once overlooked, was now. The dog's slight tilt of the head, a barely perceptible ear flick, even the adjustment of its posture, elements that might once have been considered routine or irrelevant, were suddenly integral to the courtroom's understanding. The child's insight had shifted perception from mere observation to the interpretation of behavior itself. Jurors, whose duty was to remain neutral yet attentive, leaned forward in near unison. Some whispered softly, nudging neighbors, pointing subtly toward the small girl perched on her mother's lap. "Did you notice that?" one whispered. "Her little hand, she's watching everything." Another juror nodded, eyes wide. "It's uncanny. She sees things we barely register." The energy in the jury box shifted. Curiosity had turned into fascination, and fascination into almost reverent attention. Every gesture of the dog, the witness, and even the lawyers now carried amplified significance. Even the defendant seemed unsettled. He leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. His carefully rehearsed narrative now felt exposed to forces beyond his control. He had relied on testimony and evidence, on legal strategy honed over months, yet all had been quietly challenged by a toddler's observation. A 3-year-old, whose knowledge of law or procedure was non-existent, had upended the courtroom dynamic in a single, perfectly timed statement. He shook his head subtly, murmuring under his breath, "I can't believe this." The defense attorney tried to regain a semblance of control. Rising with a calm, measured voice, they addressed the jury. "Members of the jury, while it is certainly remarkable that a child has made an observation regarding the animal present in the courtroom, we must remember that perception at her age is instinctive rather than analytical. Her words, though honest, are not evidence in the legal sense." Despite the assertion, a flicker of doubt crossed the attorney's face. Even professionals could not ignore the resonance of insight. Subtle, unspoken truths sometimes carried more weight than argumentation, and the jury seemed keenly aware of that. Oblivious to the strategic implications, returned to her focus on the dog. Her tiny fingers adjusted her grip on the rabbit, and her eyes tracked the animal with unwavering attention. She whispered softly, just to herself, "There it is," and tilted her head slightly. Her voice was almost inaudible, yet it contained certainty. Though adults could not hear the exact words, they sensed the intensity of her concentration. Every subtle movement, the dog's shift, a witness's blink, a lawyer's gesture, was catalogued silently in her mind, ready to inform the next revelation. Spectators continued to murmur, a mixture of amusement, admiration, and disbelief. Some leaned forward, catching every subtle change in expression. Others whispered commentary to neighbors. "I can't believe a 3-year-old just changed the energy of this courtroom," one spectator murmured. Another chuckled softly, "And she did it so innocently. That's what makes it brilliant." The gallery, once a background presence, had become an active participant in observing reactions, reflecting the unexpected drama had introduced. Officer remained vigilant, observing both the dog and the courtroom's reaction. The animal, trained to remain composed and responsive, now seemed to mirror heightened attention. Every minor twitch, every shift of weight became a point of interest. Noted these subtle behaviors silently, aware that the child's perception had already uncovered nuances that seasoned officers might have missed. The alignment between her observation and the dog's trained responses was remarkable, verging on uncanny, and quietly shifted his understanding of how perception and instinct could intersect in unpredictable ways. The witness, previously confident, began to shift uneasily. He had not expected scrutiny from a 3-year-old and struggled to maintain composure under the subtle pressure her observation imposed. His hands fidgeted, eyes flicked toward more than once, and his voice occasionally trembled in response to questioning he might otherwise have answered with casual certainty. The courtroom, already attuned to nuances amplified by her presence, noted each reaction. A gesture unnoticed in ordinary circumstances now seemed profoundly significant, and the adult participants adjusted their attention accordingly. Even the judge's demeanor shifted. He maintained authority but allowed a faint trace of curiosity to soften his formal tone. "It is unusual," he remarked, "for a child to perceive subtleties that might elude adults with years of experience. Let us continue with testimony, but with heightened awareness that observation comes in many forms." His statement, carefully phrased, subtly validated its perception while reinforcing the gravity of her observation. The room absorbed it, sensing that the courtroom's collective lens had been altered. The attorneys adapted swiftly. The prosecution began subtly weaving attention to the dog's behavior into their questioning, highlighting alignment or discrepancy with witness testimony. Each motion, each phrase, carried a newly amplified significance because of observation. The defense, meanwhile, struggled to counteract this unforeseen influence without dismissing it outright. They carefully monitored jurors' reactions, knowing that even a subconscious acknowledgement of the child's insight could affect interpretation. The courtroom had shifted from rigid procedure to dynamic observation, all orchestrated by a small, unassuming figure. Spectators whispered with growing amusement. A few exchanged quiet jokes, marveling at how a toddler could dominate attention without raising her voice aggressively. "I think she's the real lawyer here," one quipped softly. "She's noticing everything the adults can't." Others nodded, watching with fascination as the courtroom recalibrated to the subtle but undeniable influence of observation. Even laughter, restrained and quiet, carried an undercurrent of respect for the clarity she had demonstrated. His mother remained composed but vigilant. She could see the heightened focus in her daughter's eyes and recognized the profound impact her presence had created. Sarah whispered softly, "You're incredible, sweetie, just watch and see." Tilted her head, small lips pursed, continuing her meticulous observation. Her mind catalogued movements, gestures, and reactions in silent detail, unaware that the adults around her were recalibrating their entire approach in response. Her quiet focus had become a subtle instrument of revelation. The ripple effect extended to the officers and staff. Even those not directly involved in the trial sensed a shift in dynamics. Their awareness of subtle cues, from body language to microexpressions, became more acute. Every adjustment in posture or glance was now interpreted in the context of observation. Her perception had forced the courtroom to operate under an invisible, yet unmistakable, framework of heightened attentiveness. Adults accustomed to controlling the environment now found themselves responding to it with renewed caution. The dog, seemingly aware of the heightened attention, maintained perfect composure. Yet its subtle movements, the tilt of an ear, the shift in weight, the alignment of gaze, were now insignificant. Its focus had elevated the animal's behavior to a level of importance adults had not anticipated. Officer, silently impressed, made a mental note that the child's observation could inform future training and understanding of canine responses in dynamic environments. The defendant, now visibly uneasy, attempted to focus on his own defense. Yet he could not ignore the persistent awareness in the room. Jurors, attorneys, officers, and spectators all processed information differently, filtered through the lens had introduced. His voice, previously confident, faltered occasionally as subtle cues from the child's observation amplified every nuance. He shifted in his seat, realizing that a small, innocent insight had become a formidable force, guiding perception and influencing interpretation more than any argument or evidence could. As testimony continued, the courtroom operated under a new paradigm. Adults became more deliberate, thoughtful, and aware of subtle cues, while jurors incorporated insight into their understanding of the case. Spectators, reporters, and staff remained attentive, a mixture of amusement and admiration infusing the air. Herself remained quiet, calm, and focused, her small presence quietly dictating a shift in attention and awareness without raising her voice or acting with intent. Every gesture, every glance, every minute behavior took on amplified importance. Witnesses became more self-conscious, lawyers more strategic, and jurors more analytical. Had achieved something remarkable, a subtle yet undeniable influence on a formal courtroom, achieved not through force, experience, or authority, but through observation, clarity, and the quiet honesty of a child. Her words, brief and simple, had triggered an extraordinary ripple effect, transforming the perception of everyone present. The courtroom had transformed into a space where perception outweighed procedure, and subtle observation carried more weight than argumentation. A tiny figure seated on her mother's lap had become the silent pivot around which attention, focus, and interpretation revolved. Her simple 2 words, "bad dog," had unleashed a ripple effect that permeated every corner of the room. Adults, conditioned to trust evidence, testimony, and legal authority, were now acutely aware that a child's innocence could reveal truths hidden in plain sight. The trial's momentum had shifted. Witnesses, previously confident, now hesitated, acutely conscious of even the smallest gesture. Lawyers, mindful of perceptive gaze and the jury's subtly altered attention, adjusted questions and strategies with care. The judge, who had witnessed decades of trials, leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced, contemplating the extraordinary effect of a 3-year-old on courtroom dynamics. He recognized the gravity of the moment. No ordinary testimony or objection could rival the clarity and authority emanating from a child. Unaware of the monumental influence she wielded, continued to observe. Her tiny fingers occasionally clutched the frayed ears of her stuffed rabbit, her eyes tracking the police dog with unblinking intensity. Every subtle movement of the animal, the flick of an ear, the shift of weight, the alignment of gaze, was catalogued in her mind. Adults around her responded subconsciously, reading significance into behaviors that had once gone unnoticed. The courtroom had become of amplified perception, and the child was its quiet conductor. Officer, still holding the dog's collar, maintained professional composure but could not mask the astonishment in his eyes. The German shepherd, trained for discipline and observation, responded to subtle cues in the environment that aligned perfectly with focus. Each adjustment, every subtle behavior of the dog, now carried amplified importance. Realized that its perception had illuminated a dimension of interaction between human and animal that even experienced officers had not fully appreciated. Her clarity had made the invisible visible. The jury, fully attuned, leaned forward in unison. Members whispered softly among themselves, weighing gestures and glances, integrating observation into their understanding. Each subtle movement of the witness, shifting hands, hesitant eye contact, slight fidgets, was interpreted in a new light. Even jurors with decades of life experience acknowledged the profound impact of a child's honesty and focus. The dynamic of the trial had irrevocably changed. Decisions were no longer guided solely by argumentation or evidence, but by a combination of perception and instinct catalyzed by innocence. The prosecution adjusted their approach, capitalizing on observation. They emphasized the alignment between the dog's behavior and the witness's subtle inconsistencies, carefully framing questions to draw attention to previously overlooked details. Every motion, pause, and word was amplified by the jury's heightened attentiveness. The defense, while attempting to redirect focus to traditional forms of evidence, could not entirely counteract the ripple effect of insight. The child had reshaped the courtroom's lens, leaving adults navigating an uncharted territory of perception and influence. Spectators whispered, exchanged glances, and occasionally chuckled at the irony of the situation. A 3-year-old had become the unexpected focal point of a formal, highly structured legal proceeding. Some whispered admiration. "She's brilliant. She sees what we can't. That's a sharp little mind." Others laughed quietly, amused by the improbability of the scenario. A toddler influencing courtroom strategy with nothing but observation and a single, simple declaration. Its impact was simultaneously profound and delightfully human, blending humor, astonishment, and respect into a single, unforgettable moment. The witness, now visibly uneasy, shifted repeatedly in his seat. His earlier confidence had given way to subtle uncertainty, amplified by the attention the child drew. Each gesture, glance, and tone carried an amplified significance that he could not control. For the first time in the trial, he hesitated mid-response, aware that even the smallest action was under scrutiny. His presence had introduced a variable beyond his preparation, a force of perception that could not be dismissed or ignored. The ripple effect of innocence had penetrated his composure, forcing him to confront truths he had hoped to obscure. The judge, sensing the culmination of this unique dynamic, adjusted his posture, leaning slightly forward. "This courtroom has witnessed something remarkable," he said, voice calm but reflective. "We have observed that insight and clarity are not bound by age or experience. Let us proceed with deliberation, keeping in mind the lessons we have been offered, that perception and truth can emerge from the most unexpected sources." His words, carefully measured, acknowledged influence without undermining the legal process, and the room absorbed them in silence, the weight of her observation still palpable. His mother, Sarah, whispered softly to her daughter, "Sweetie, you've made everyone stop and listen. That's incredible." Looked up, small eyes reflecting calm focus, as if she were merely nodding an observation rather than influencing an entire courtroom. Her innocence, so complete, contrasted with the profound effect of her words. She had acted on instinct, curiosity, and clarity, yet the result was extraordinary. The courtroom now functioned under a collective awareness that combined adult experience with childlike perception. The defendant, though unsettled, observed the unfolding consequences with a mixture of amazement and apprehension. His carefully rehearsed narrative had been subtly undermined, not by argument or evidence, but by a child's perception. The irony was not lost on him. In a room structured for authority, experience, and control, a 3-year-old had demonstrated the raw power of observation untainted by expectation. He clenched his hands briefly, recognizing that the courtroom's collective attention had shifted in ways he could not fully anticipate. The dog, still alert, responded subtly to the heightened attention. A slight tilt of the head, a tiny adjustment in posture, a subtle flick of the tail, all became insignificance. Officer noted each movement, understanding that the animal's responses had been illuminated by keen observation. The alignment of perception between child and dog was uncanny, a demonstration of instinct, attention, and clarity that even seasoned professionals could not replicate. The courtroom's understanding of behavior, both human and animal, had been irrevocably transformed. As deliberation approached, tension mixed with quiet admiration. Lawyers prepared final arguments, witnesses straightened in their seats, and jurors exchanged thoughtful glances. Every participant was aware of the subtle influence of observation. Her simple words had redefined focus, perception, and interpretation within the courtroom. Adults, trained to analyze evidence and behavior meticulously, now integrated a child's insight into their understanding, acknowledging that clarity and honesty often come in the most unexpected forms. Finally, the moment arrived. The judge called the courtroom to order, gaze sweeping across jurors, attorneys, witnesses, and spectators alike. "We have considered testimony, evidence, and observation carefully," he said, voice steady but reflective. "We have also witnessed the value of insight that transcends age and experience. This court acknowledges the extraordinary clarity offered by a young observer, and we proceed with deliberation fully aware of its influence." Heads nodded, whispers faded, and attention returned to the formalities of justice, now imbued with a quiet reverence for the unexpected. Remained calm, her small fingers still clutching the rabbit. She had not anticipated recognition, applause, or even acknowledgement, yet the courtroom had responded to her clarity with awe and attention. Adults adjusted their focus, jurors leaned forward, and witnesses carried a subtle weight of awareness that had not existed before. The ripple effect of her simple words had reached far beyond what anyone could have imagined. When the verdict was read, the room fell into tense silence. Each participant, from the judge to the jurors, awaited the culmination of proceedings shaped, in part, by observation. As the gavel struck and the decision was announced, eyes turned toward the tiny girl who had catalyzed a subtle but profound shift in perception. The courtroom collectively recognized that her simple, two-word observation had left an indelible mark, influencing interpretation, attention, and understanding. As the proceedings concluded, whispers erupted across the gallery. Spectators exchanged wide-eyed glances, reporters scribbled final notes, and even officers nodded quietly in acknowledgement of the rare and extraordinary moment they had witnessed. His presence had demonstrated a timeless truth, that clarity, honesty, and observation are not constrained by age. Adults, trained and experienced, had been humbled by the simplicity and authority of a child's perception. His mother reached down, gently brushing hair from her daughter's face. "You were amazing, sweetie," she whispered, tilted her head, eyes still tracking the dog, unaware of the extraordinary influence she had wielded. Her clarity and innocence had transformed a routine courtroom session into a moment of collective reflection, humility, and wonder. The ripple effect of her words would be remembered long after the trial ended. The courtroom emptied slowly, participants exchanging murmured impressions. Lawyers discussed strategy and interpretation, jurors replayed the subtle influences they had noticed, and spectators marveled at the rare spectacle of a child reshaping perception. Officer walked alongside the dog, reflecting silently on the alignment between the animal's behavior and its insight. Even the judge lingered, nodding that the courtroom had experienced something extraordinary, beyond procedure or precedent. Still clutching her rabbit, was carried lightly by her mother, leaving the courtroom as a tiny figure whose influence had surpassed all expectations. Her small voice, simple observation, and unfiltered honesty had reminded every adult present that the most profound truths often emerge in the quietest, least expected forms. The trial, evidence, and verdict were important, but the memory of a 3-year-old pointing, speaking, and commanding attention would endure as a story of clarity, innocence, and the power of observation. And as the doors closed behind them, the courtroom remained silent, awash in the afterglow of astonishment, humor, and respect. For in the end, everyone knew they had witnessed something remarkable: a 3-year-old girl, a police dog, and 2 words that had left them speechless, forever changing the way they perceived attention, truth, and the extraordinary potential hidden in the simplest of observations.